The lunchroom at West Ridge Middle School had always been a silent battlefield. Not where fists flew or food fights broke out, it was quieter. A look was enough to decide who belonged, who mattered and who didn't. 13-year-old Ava Sinclair sat in the back of the cafeteria, picking at the edges of her peanut butter sandwich, pretending not to hear the whispers 2 tables away. "Why does she always sit alone?" someone muttered. "Maybe she doesn't have any friends." The words were familiar. Ava was used to feeling like an outsider. As one of the few black students at West Ridge, she learned early on that fitting in wasn't an option. She kept herself invisible, moving through the halls like a shadow. It was easier to keep to herself. But Connor Tate wouldn't let her go. He made Ava his favorite target. Connor was the kind of guy who walked like he owned the place, the son of a wealthy businessman, friends in all the right places. Teachers always spoke of him with a smile, and he could get away with just a few excuses. For months, Ava endured. The shoves in the hallways, the knocked-over books, the dripping taunts. No one called it bullying, just kids being kids, but it never stopped. Today, he crossed the line. Ava had barely taken a bite when a hand snatched a paper bag off her desk. She looked up. Connor was standing there, grinning as if this were some harmless prank. "What do you have, Sinclair?" He ripped open the bag, pulling out the sandwich with exaggerated disgust. But this time, Ava didn't suffer quietly. "Give it here." Her voice was quiet but firm. The murmurs around them died down. Connor raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Oh. And what if I don't?" "Then I'll tell my dad," she said, not taking her eyes off him. "He's the new sheriff in town." Connor stiffened. There was a long moment, and then his fake laugh came, but it was less confident than before. He dropped the sandwich on the table with a shrug. "Just kidding, Sinclair." "Don't touch me again," Ava said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes did not waver. Connor turned away, and for the first time, Ava felt like she was no longer a shadow. The lunchroom was abuzz with laughter and chatter, but Ava was focused on the cold sandwich on her tray. Connor sat at the next table, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Your dad's new job doesn't really pay for food." Laughter rippled across the table behind him. Eva's fingers curled under the table, her jaw clenched, but she remained silent. She always did. Connor leaned closer, his voice fake sweet. "You know, you really should say thank you. I was just trying to help you diet." He picked up her sandwich and tossed it over his shoulder. It fell to the floor with a soft thud. Eva's stomach twisted, but she wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of them. She reached down to pick up the remains of her lunch, but before she could, a foot came down, smashing it against the tile. Connor sneered. "Oh, sorry." For a moment, the world shrank. It was just Ava, her crushed sandwich, and their laughter ringing in her ears. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. But she already knew. She grabbed her backpack and stood, pushing past the tables, ignoring the whispers, the giggles. Heat burned behind her eyes. She walked through the cafeteria door, past the lockers, all the way to the girls' bathroom. Ava locked the door, sat on the closed toilet seat, and breathed slowly. This wasn't new. She would wait until the lunch bell rang, then slip away and pretend nothing had happened. Because telling someone never worked. The teachers would say just ignore him. The principal would call it a misunderstanding. And tomorrow it would all start over. But Ava didn't know that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would fight back. And tomorrow, Connor would push her further than he ever had before. That afternoon, Ava barely spoke when she got home. She went straight to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She wasn't the type to criticize. She knew how to disappear, even in her own home. But her father had noticed. His deep voice echoed through the door. "Is everything okay, Eva hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. The lunchroom was abuzz with laughter and chatter, but Eva was focused on the cold sandwich on her tray. Connor sat at the next table, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Your dad's new job doesn't really pay for food." Laughter rippled across the table behind him. Eva's fingers curled under the table, her jaw clenched, but she remained silent. She always did. Connor leaned closer, his voice fake sweet. "You know, you really should say thank you. I was just trying to help you diet." He picked up her sandwich and tossed it over his shoulder. It fell to the floor with a soft thud. Eva's stomach twisted, but she wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of them. She reached down to pick up the remains of her lunch, but before she could, a foot came down, smashing it against the tile. Connor sneered. "Oh, sorry." For a moment, the world shrank. It was just Eva, her crushed sandwich, and their laughter ringing in her ears. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. But she already knew. She grabbed her backpack and stood, pushing past the tables, ignoring the whispers, the giggles. Heat burned behind her eyes. She walked through the cafeteria door, past the lockers, all the way to the girls' bathroom. Eva locked the door, sat on the closed toilet seat, and breathed slowly. This wasn't new. She would wait until the lunch bell rang, then slip away and pretend nothing had happened. Because telling someone never worked. The teachers would say just ignore him. The principal would call it a misunderstanding. And tomorrow it would all start over. But Eva didn't know that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would fight back. And tomorrow, Connor would push her further than he ever had before. That afternoon, Eva barely spoke when she got home. She went straight to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She wasn't the type to criticize. She knew how to disappear, even in her own home. But her father had noticed. His deep voice echoed through the door. "Is everything okay?" Eva hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. Ava stood there, in the quiet room, the late afternoon light filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows on the walls. In her hands she held the sweater, wrinkled and soft, the warmth of her body still lingering. Before she dropped it on the bed, she paused, feeling tired. But this time it was more than just the usual exhaustion. There was something stuck in her chest, a feeling she couldn't name. She closed her eyes, breathing out slowly. There was a pause. Then a sigh of relief, mixed with a silent ache. Dinner would be in an hour. But right now, she couldn't think about food. She just waited until the sound of his footsteps faded away. And when the sound was gone, she dared to breathe out, as if released from an invisible pressure. Connor had had enough, moving to a new town, walking into a cold principal's office and cleaning up the mess his predecessor had left behind. But that didn't excuse his actions. She didn't want, and couldn't, add any more school drama to her life. Ava had always tried to stay out of trouble. But Connor was determined not to let her ignore him. It started the next morning. Ava was getting her books from her locker when she felt a sharp tap on the back. She stumbled, almost hitting her forehead against the cold metal. Laughter rang out behind her. When she turned, she saw Connor, leaning against the lockers, his eyes teasing. "Sorry, Sinclair. Didn't see you there." She clenched her hands at her sides, but didn't respond. She knew that was what he wanted, a response. And when she didn't, the annoyance in Connor's eyes only grew. By lunchtime, the rumors had spread. Ava wasn't sure who started it, but she could guess. As she walked into the cafeteria, whispers followed like a shadow. "Did you hear that?" She tried to fight Connor. "No way. Really?" And she was swinging her arms. I bet she cried afterwards. Ava's throat was dry. Connor sat at his desk, grinning, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. Her fingers tightened around the hem of her sweater. This was worse than the shoving, the stolen lunches, the tripping in the hallways. It was isolating her completely. She sat alone that day. And the next. And the next. By Friday, Ava thought maybe Connor was bored. Maybe he'd let it go. But she was wrong. When the final bell rang, Ava walked toward the front door, eager to go home. She was halfway across the parking lot when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Where are you going in such a hurry, Sinclair?" "Hey Sinclair." She ignored him and kept walking. "Where are you going? I thought we were friends." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. The sidewalk seemed too wide, too empty. A hand suddenly grabbed her wrist. She jerked back. "Don't touch me." Connor grinned, as if this were a game. "Relax, I just wanted to say hi." The guys behind him laughed. They always did. Ava's pulse thundered in her ears. "Leave me alone." Connor leaned in, his voice low. "Or, what are you going to say about me?" Ava swallowed, her mind racing with thoughts. Then he tugged at her backpack strap. "You're just mad because no one cares," he scoffed. Something snapped inside Ava before she knew it. She shoved him. Connor stumbled back, surprised for the first time. The smile disappeared. It should have ended there. But it didn't. Connor wasn't used to being embarrassed. And in that moment, he decided to make sure Ava would never forget. Ava barely slept that night. As soon as her head hit the pillow, her mind replayed the scene in the parking lot. The look on Connor's face as she shoved him. The moment his friends fell silent before the laughter returned. She'd never touched him before. Never fought back. And now, she didn't know what was coming next. Saturday passed without incident. Then Sunday. Monday morning came. Ava convinced herself that maybe Connor had decided to move on. She should have known better. It started on the stairs. Then came the whispers in third period. The giggles turned into something else. As she walked down the hall, students turned their phones toward her, pretending to see something funny. Some pointed. Some chuckled. Others just shook their heads, like they knew something she didn't. Ava's stomach twisted. Eva slid into her seat in English class, her eyes glued to the scratched surface of her desk as if it were her only escape. She tried to ignore the murmurs around her, the giggles, the glances she felt without looking up. The air around her was thick, heavy. Then, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "The pictures are beautiful, Sinclair." The tone was so cloyingly sweet that Eva froze. She raised her head, her eyes meeting Lena Carmichael, one of Connor's closest friends, who was smirking and tapping away at her phone. Eva's chest tightened, her heart starting to race. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for the phone in her backpack. When she unlocked it, the screen was instantly flooded with notifications. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes fell on the viral photo. It was her, taken in the school parking lot, the moment she pushed Connor. But someone had edited the image. Eva's face was twisted in rage, her eyes wide and terrifying. Above the photo were the words, "Sinclair is mentally ill and can't control himself." Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the comments. Dozens, then hundreds. Each line felt like a knife. "She looks crazy. No wonder she has no friends. Connor should hit her back. I heard she tried to scratch him in the face." This was no longer a rumor. It had become something worse, proof that everyone could see and believe. Eva's throat closed, forcing herself to swallow the pain that was rising. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Lena leaned forward again, her voice syrupy but mocking. "Connor said you have a temper problem. Maybe you should get help." Eva's heart was pounding, but she kept her eyes straight ahead, her lips pressed together. Her fingers dug into her palms, leaving red marks. She had never felt so humiliated. By lunchtime, the photo was all over the school. By the time school was out, it was all anyone talked about. And when Eva walked through the door of her house, she wanted nothing more than to disappear. But her father was waiting. He was sitting in a chair, phone in hand, his face stern. "Sit down," he said, his voice eerily calm. Eva sat down, stiff, backpack still slung over her shoulder. Her stomach clenched as her father turned the phone screen toward her. There was a photo she wished she had never seen. His face was still unreadable, but this time, there was something different, a cold, simmering anger, like a storm coming. Eva could feel it. Her heart pounded, her hands shook, but she did nothing. She couldn't. She knew his eyes were dark, and she knew exactly who had done it. A lump formed in her throat, choking her voice. "Dad, please," her voice was almost inaudible. But he wasn't listening anymore. Her father had dialed, and in that moment, Eva knew Connor had finally gotten the wrong guy. Eva's father wasn't a man who yelled. He didn't slam doors, he never threatened. When he was angry, his silence was more terrifying than any scream. And right now, the silence in the living room was thick, suffocating. He raised the phone to his ear. His expression was unreadable, but Eva saw the steely determination in his eyes. "Principal Dawson, we need to talk now." Her father's voice was calm but authoritative, the air in the room stilled. Eva's stomach clenched. The man who had spent years dealing with gang violence and corruption in the city was now handling her school play. And he didn't think of it as a play. From the other end of the line, Eva could hear Principal Dawson's deep voice, hesitant. Something about looking into it, about kids being kids. But her father wouldn't let that go. "No, we're not looking into it. We're fixing it. Today." His voice was low but powerful. Eva sat still as a statue. She had never seen her father like this. Within an hour, they had driven to West Ridge Middle. The building looked different in the evening light, emptier and quieter. Principal Dawson was waiting, standing next to the office staff, his arms crossed defensively. "I understand your concerns," Dawson said with a wry smile, but the smile quickly disappeared when Eva's father didn't respond. "Connor Tate has been harassing my daughter for over a month," he said, his voice even but sharp. "And now, he's spreading false accusations about her online. I want these taken down. Immediately." He pulled out his phone, holding it up, the screen lighting up with irrefutable evidence. Principal Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "Let's not blow this out of proportion." "No," her father interrupted, his voice unwavering. "I don't care what his parents tell you. I want justice. And I want it now." Ava sat rigidly in the chair, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Her father stood next to her, his presence towering and implacable. His voice, when he spoke, was hard as iron. "I'm very interested in what he's done, Principal Dawson." The principal hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his desk. We don't want to punish a student without." Her father took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Do you know what my job is, Dawson?" The air in the room shifted. "I enforce the law. And last I checked, cyberbullying and targeted harassment fall under serious offenses." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "But you know what's worse? A school that turns a blind eye to it." Ava watched the color drain from Principal Dawson's face. I'll speak with the Tates again." Her father didn't move. "You'll do more than speak. You'll make sure that photo is taken down. You'll make sure this never happens again. And you will hold Connor accountable." Ava had never seen Principal Dawson look this rattled before. But at that moment, he did, as the office door opened and Connor Tate walked in, followed by his parents. Richard Tate entered first, a man who carried an air of wealth and power, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored suit that screamed money. The kind of man who owned country clubs and golf courses. His wife, smaller and more delicate, flashed a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Connor, however, had lost his usual smugness. "Chief Sinclair," Richard Tate said smoothly, his voice polished and controlled. "I really don't understand why this has turned into such a spectacle." Ava's father didn't blink. "Your son did that." Mrs. Tate gave a brittle laugh. "Oh, come now. They're just kids. They push each other's buttons. This is all so unnecessary." Ava's fists clenched at the word. Unnecessary. Her father took a slow, steady breath. "If my daughter had done to your son what he did to her, would we be standing here? Or would you already have a lawyer lined up?" Richard Tate's jaw twitched. "Let's not make this about." "It's already about something," her father interrupted. "It's about power. It's about what you let your son get away with. And it ends here." Connor shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward his parents. Her father turned back to Principal Dawson. "So what is the school's official response?" Principal Dawson hesitated, glancing at Tate's before clearing his throat. "Connor is suspended, effective immediately." The room fell silent. Miss Tate gasped, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "Suspended? For a stupid prank?" Mr. Tate's face darkened, his eyes flashing with anger. "You can't do this. Do you know who I am?" Her father didn't blink. "Do you know who I am?" His voice dropped, and the room seemed to grow colder. Mr. Tate's mouth pressed into a thin line. "This isn't over." But Ava's father didn't flinch. "You're not." Connor swallowed. He wasn't smiling anymore. This time, he was the one who looked scared. Connor Tate didn't come to school the next day, or the day after that. By the end of the week, rumors had begun to spread. "I heard his dad tried to fight the school board about his suspension." "No, I heard his mom call the district, asking them to remove it from his record," someone whispered. "His family is thinking about pulling him out and sending him to private school." Ava listened but didn't say a word. She just walked quietly to class, keeping her head down and ignoring the stares around her. But this time, they weren't filled with pity or laughter. They were filled with something else, respect. By Monday, her picture had disappeared from every social media account. Principal Dawson made an announcement about online harassment and reiterated the zero-tolerance policy for bullying. It had been the kind of speech no one had paid attention to before. But now people were listening. On Wednesday, Ava could walk down the hallway without feeling the weight of whispers behind her back. The giggles had died down, and her footsteps on the stairs had softened. A few students even nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement that they had seen what had happened. And then there were those who still didn't know which side to take. At lunch, Ava sat alone. She was used to it. But today, as she picked up her tray, a figure slid silently into the seat opposite her. Ava looked up. Lena Carmichael smiled. Ava's stomach clenched, tension building as she waited for the next bad thing. She half expected another sarcastic remark, another sweet punch to her. Instead, Lena just pushed her food around on her plate with her fork, her eyes avoiding Ava as if afraid of catching something. "Guess you got the last laugh, huh?" Lena said, her voice low and hesitant. Ava didn't respond. She didn't have the energy for this anymore. She just stayed silent, feeling tired. Lena cleared her throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Look, I'm not really trying to be a part of it all," she said, her voice a belated excuse. Ava slammed her fork down on the tray, the clatter of it sharp. Lena winced, but Ava didn't care. She picked up the tray and stood, ready to leave. "He deserved it, you know." Lena's voice was low, but Ava heard it. Ava turned her head. For the first time, their eyes met. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just something else. Guilt. Remorse, maybe. But Ava said nothing. She just looked away. Because today, for the first time in a long time, she had a choice. She wasn't the one hiding anymore. Connor Tate had and could, maybe that meant something had finally changed. But Ava wasn't sure. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table while her father poured her a cup of coffee. The air was warm, but she still felt a heaviness in her chest. "How was school?" her father asked, like any other day. "Better." Ava shrugged. He raised an eyebrow, looking surprised. "Just better." She smiled, for the first time that day. "Better than last week." A smile flickered across his face. "Good." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "You know, I'm proud of you." Ava blinked, taken aback by the words. "You didn't do anything." Her father set his cup down, his eyes softening. "You stood up for yourself." She hesitated, staring at the wood grain of the table beneath her. "You shouldn't have." His expression softened. "No. You shouldn't have." Ava exhaled, feeling heavy but also somewhat relieved. "What will happen to Connor?" Her father leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "That depends on him." Ava frowned, her eyes uncertain. "What do you mean?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing each word. And Ava waited, knowing that this answer could change everything. Connor had once been seemingly untouchable. He had great friends, a perfect family, and had traveled the world, living a life that most people could only dream of. But none of that could hide the truth, that Connor was not invulnerable. And Ava was the first to prove it. After a long period of hurt, Ava had found strength within herself. She was no longer afraid of Connor. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest victory of all. When she walked through the school gates this time, she didn't have to look over her shoulder. She was no longer the one hiding, no longer the one afraid. That weekend, Connor's family pulled him out of school. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he was transferring to a private academy in another county, others that his father had used his influence to send him to a boarding school out of state. Either way, Connor was gone. And for the first time in a long time, Ava could breathe. But Connor's departure didn't make everything suddenly perfect. The wounds he left behind were still there, the days of humiliation, the harsh words, and the sense of isolation that didn't disappear overnight. There were still the whispered glances, the conversations that stopped when Ava walked by, and the confusion on the faces of those who didn't know whether to ignore or acknowledge what had happened. But Ava no longer waited for their approval. Instead, she did something she had never dared to do before. She raised her hand in class, spoke up when she had something to say, and looked people in the eye as she passed them in the hallway. And very slowly, the isolation began to crack. On Friday, a girl from her math class sat down next to Ava at lunch, not saying much, just a simple but meaningful hello. The next day, someone asked her if she wanted to join them on a project team, instead of letting her teacher assign her one. And on Monday, a boy from her English class smiled at her and started a conversation. Things weren't perfect. But little by little, Ava was finding her place, no longer the girl who was being pushed around, but someone who was strong, brave, and ready to move forward. The boy had always been a quiet, withdrawn child, never involved in anything. But today, as he passed Eva's locker, he muttered under his breath, his voice so low that no one could hear him. What he did was terrible. Eva turned her head, her eyes filled with surprise. The boy adjusted the strap of his backpack, barely looking at her, his voice still low but clearer. "If I had known it was this bad, I would have." He paused, shaking his head, as if unable to finish the sentence. "It doesn't matter." But it happened. She fell silent, but the boy continued, his voice shaking a little this time. It matters. Because everyone saw it at last. Not just you, Eva. But everything that happened. What they let happen. Because, silence is a crime. Eva didn't know what to say. She just nodded, a silent nod of agreement. And to the boy, it seemed enough. That evening, Eva sat in the living room, flipping through a book, but not reading a word. Her father read the newspaper, the television blared with some crime show, but no one really paid attention. You know. Her father said suddenly, folding the paper and placing it on the table. I had my own Connor Tate when I was your age. Eva looked up, surprised. Really? He nodded. There was no social media, but the game was the same. His voice was low, his eyes distant as if reminiscing. There's always someone who thinks they can do anything and get away with it. Eva hesitated. What did I do about it? Her father exhaled slowly. I didn't have much choice. He saw her frown and turned to look at her, his voice calm but firm. You have to make a decision. Let him decide who you are, or decide for yourself. Eva swallowed. Her father smiled slightly. And you see, I'm sitting here, right? A small laugh escaped her, surprising even her. Yes, I guess. He patted her shoulder. And so do you. Eva sat there, silent. For so long, Connor had seemed to hold all the power. He seemed to decide where things would go. But now, she realized, that wasn't true. She had her choice, too. And perhaps it was time for her to make a decision. On Monday morning, Eva walked to school with a new feeling in her heart, not anxiety or fear, but determination. The hallways seemed different, or maybe she was different. Things didn't feel so heavy, didn't feel so alone. Lena Carmichael nodded to her from across the hall. It wasn't an apology, not an excuse, but something close. An acknowledgement. A respect. The boy from English held the door open for her without saying anything. It was a small gesture, but it held more than words. As Eva sat down in the cafeteria, a girl from history slid into the seat across from her. Do you mind if I sit here? She asked, her voice soft but sincere. Eva looked at her for a moment, then shrugged. Go ahead. She hadn't expected an apology from the entire school. She didn't need to. Because she had already won, not by eliminating Connor Tate, but by making a difference. By making sure that next time, someone like him wouldn't win so easily. Because next time, people wouldn't just look the other way. No one would have to fight to be treated with respect. No one would have to prove that they deserved to exist without harassment. But the truth is, standing up for yourself is never easy. Sometimes, people will still look the other way. Sometimes, they will pretend it's not happening. But silence is what allows bullies to win. And the moment you stop being silent, the moment you refuse to let them define you, that's when they lose their power. If this story touches you, consider speaking up. Because these conversations matter. And the more we talk about them, the harder it will be for the world to turn its back on the truth.